Hi everyone, and welcome to Korchik's class, where we analyze and review some of the major topics in social studies. Today, we're going to be looking at the Cold War, and at its peak, the different fronts that the Cold War was fought on. Because the Cold War wasn't a hot war in the sense that the two superpowers never directly fought each other in open warfare, which is why we call it the Cold War. What it was a war of ideology fought on different other fronts to try and prove that one ideology was superior to the other one. So the Soviet Union tried to prove that communism was the more superior global ideology that everybody else should follow, and the United States was trying to show that liberal democracy and capitalism were the dominant ideologies, the better ideologies that everybody around the world should follow. The two sides had competing foreign policies. On the side of the Soviet Union, they had a policy of expansionism, where a core element of their communist ideology was to spread that ideology to as many countries as possible. On the flip side, the United States adopted this idea of containment, trying to contain communist countries to where they already were, and try to prevent that expansionist spread as much as possible. In a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947, Truman outlined this American philosophy in what we now call the Truman Doctrine speech. And in this speech, he said that at the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. Right? So to Truman and the United States, it was critically important that liberal democracy is allowed to thrive in different parts of the world, and that the communist ideology of the Soviet Union is not allowed to expand, not allowed to spread. In addition to these outward foreign policy goals, the Cold War was fought in several different arenas, using several different strategies to again try to prove to the world that one ideology was superior over the other one. The first was propaganda. And both sides employed posters, made films, or created animated films to try and highlight the superiority of one ideology over the other.
Hurry, step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, ism. Government control, no worry about votes, name your own salary. Bigger crops, lower costs. Why, ism even makes the weather perfect every day. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
Another arena was what we call the prestige war, where again, through big accomplishments, both sides wanted to prove that it was communism or it was liberal democracy and capitalism that was more effective at getting these big things done. An example of that was the space race, where both the Soviet Union and United States invested huge amounts of money to beat the other side in various landmark accomplishments in space, right? So it was the first person in space was the first big accomplishment that they tried to accomplish, and the Soviet Union won that one. And then first person to orbit the Earth. Again, Soviet Union was the first there. And then they shifted their sights towards being the first to land humans on the moon. And the United States ended up claiming a pretty big victory there, as we know. Part of the prestige war also happened in sports, where both sides furiously competed during the Olympics, and in sports like hockey, where, for example, the 1972 Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union was a huge spectacle, trying to highlight the accomplishments of both sides in hockey and trying to show that one side was superior to the other one in hockey. And Canada scored a pretty big, pretty close victory in that 1972 Summit Series. Another example was the Olympic Miracle on Ice, where a ragtag bunch of American amateur hockey players beat the very well-regarded Russian Red Army team from the Soviet Union. Another arena that the Cold War was contested in was in espionage, where both sides were tremendously secretive about their technological advancement and, most importantly, their military and nuclear capability. And so it was as important as possible for the other side to know where they were at. And so we saw the growth of the spy agencies, the CIA in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union, as a way to try and infiltrate those secrets and try to learn as much about the other side as possible in an environment that was really hard to do so. So there were spies embedded in the governments of the two countries. Spy technologies such as spy planes were used by both sides to try and learn as much as possible about where nuclear installations might be, and so on. Another arena was the idea of deterrence, where both sides pretty quickly realized that in a world of nuclear weapons, the next major war would be a nuclear war and would be incredibly devastating to both sides. The idea around this was mutually assured destruction, very appropriately acronymed MAD. And the idea of mutually assured destruction was that if both sides did end up going to nuclear war, it would basically assure the destruction of both the United States and the Soviet Union, because nuclear weapons are so destructive that soon as one side launches nuclear weapons to the other side would retaliate, which would annihilate the populations and the cities of both countries. And the idea was that they knew that this would be so destructive, right? They knew they would mutually assure to destroy themselves, and so they wanted to create this balance of power where they wanted to prevent war from happening, because they knew that if they did go to war, they would destroy each other, so they would be signing their own fate by attacking the other superpower. And so that created this deterrence effect, where they didn't go to this hot war because they knew if they did, it would be catastrophic. What that meant, though, is that they needed to ensure that mutually assured destruction would happen. So we had this nuclear arms race where both the Soviet Union and the United States was building up their nuclear stockpiles at a rapid rate, to a point where both the United States and the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear weapons that they could use to annihilate the other side if it came down to a nuclear war. Because of this, there was a genuine fear in society that a nuclear war was imminent and could happen. And so just like today we have fire drills and we have lockdown drills, in the 1950s especially, children in the United States and presumably in the Soviet Union had what we call duck and cover drills, where you tried to protect yourself from the nuclear blast by ducking and covering into whatever you could find, essentially, be it under your desks, next to a wall. And the United States Civil Service Department created videos in order to try and propagate these ideas and try to get students in schools to practice.
That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous.
Related to deterrence was the idea of brinkmanship, where both the Soviet Union and the United States were playing this game of chicken, trying to get the other side to blink first. But this game of chicken involved nuclear weapons, so a very dangerous game. And they tried to push each other as close as possible to making that first move, because to be the first to back down would be a pretty serious hit to your pride. And if you were the first to back down in this game of brinkmanship, then the other side immediately got the upper hand in this conflicting relationship. A major example of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have an entirely separate video devoted entirely to it. But the United States discovered nuclear weapons installations in Cuba that were supplied by the Soviet Union, and the United States saw that as a problem, eventually decided to blockade Cuba to prevent any new nuclear weapons from coming, and threats were flying on both sides to the point where the Soviet Union was the first to blink, removed its weapons from Cuba, and the Cold War shifted into what we call a period of détente, where they came so close to that nuclear war as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis that they decided they needed to cool off these hostilities a little bit. Finally, the hot elements of the Cold War were what we called proxy wars, where the Soviet Union and the United States, their soldiers never directly fought each other, but they supported elements of local armies and local populations in order to try and win localized conflicts. One example of that was the Korean War, where the Soviet Union and China supported the North Korean forces and the Americans supported the South Korean forces, along with a United Nations mission to try and stop communist expansion on the Korean Peninsula. Similarly, in Vietnam, the Soviet Union supported the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and the United States supported the South Vietnamese to try and prevent that spread of communism throughout all of Vietnam. Eventually, the United States realized that in order to succeed, they would have to send in their own troops, and the United States became pretty heavily military involved in the conflict of Vietnam, but eventually had to pull out, and this was seen as a pretty major blow to the United States. In the 1980s, we had sort of the flipped example of this happening in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union became directly involved in a conflict to secure communist dominance over the country of Afghanistan, and the United States supported local militias, the Mujahideen, in order to try and prevent that Soviet expansion. All of this begs some pretty important questions, because these different Cold War strategies and different theaters of battle in the Cold War, even though they didn't necessarily erupt into a major nuclear war, had some pretty long-lasting consequences. And both countries went to pretty enormous lengths to try and win in these different arenas. And the question is, to what extent was that justified over simply this conflict between ideologies to try and prove that one ideology was supreme to another? Were all those lives lost in proxy wars, like in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan, worth that? Was the money spent on endeavors like the space race worth that? Is the nuclear proliferation around the world leading to possibly a less safe world that always has this looming threat of the use of nuclear weapons? Is that worth it, right? So there are some pretty lasting consequences of the Cold War that we still live with today, even though we are at this point over 30 years removed from the fall of the Soviet Union. Those legacies are still around, and we continue to deal with some of these legacies when we look at, for example, the ongoing conflict between North and South Korea. and the relationship between Cuba and the United States, which remains pretty challenging. So when we look at the world today, a lot of what we see can be traced back to these different theaters of the Cold War. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.